Remember regime change in Venezuela? How's that going for Donald Trump? In the capital, Caracas, there are huge posters all around the city with a slogan, Los queremos de vuelta, which means we want them back. They're calling for the return of the former president Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores, who've both been in US custody since January. And yet, at the same time in Caracas, the interim president Delcy Rodriguez welcomes US officials like old friends. As Maduro is about to appear in court in New York this week, we go inside Venezuela to understand these two contradictory views of the United States and how things are changing for Venezuelans. From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redmond in London, and this is The Global Story on YouTube.
I'm Ione Wells, the BBC South America correspondent, and I'm based here in Sao Paulo, but I've just got back from a 2-week trip to Venezuela, which is the first time I've been since 2024. So it was very, very nice to be back.
So you reported when you were in Caracas from a pro-government rally. What was that like, and who did you speak to? What did they tell you?
Yeah, that's right. It was interesting landing in Caracas, because when you arrive there, it could seem like nothing's really changed. There's still billboards of Nicolas Maduro everywhere. In the airport, the highways are filled with billboards of pictures of Maduro and his wife with the hashtag "We want them back." And the day that I landed in Caracas was exactly 2 months after the US seized Nicolas Maduro. So this rally had been put on by the government to essentially mark that anniversary and call for his return. Now, quite similar to rallies of his that I've been to in the past, there were buses that had been put on by the government to get people there. There were crowds of people all wearing T-shirts with his face on, waving Venezuelan flags. There's a lot of very public displays of affection for Nicolas Maduro, and certainly a lot of the people I spoke to in the crowd repeated quite loyalist slogans, saying that he's the constitutional president, that they want him back, that he's a prisoner of war. Interestingly, though, when I spoke to people on the sidelines of it, or even some people in the crowd, I immediately got this sense from quite a lot of people there that they weren't really telling me exactly how they really felt. Quite a lot of those people were essentially public sector workers, employees of the state, who felt that they had to go, otherwise they might face some kind of repercussions in their work, in their job. What I found was interesting was particularly some of the young people I spoke to. One 22-year-old woman, for example, who worked for the government, who didn't want to use her real name in my reporting, but she told me very explicitly that, in her words, everything at this rally was false, was a lie, that these were all public sector employees who had been told to go to these rallies. Otherwise, they wouldn't get a government bonus. They wouldn't get a top up to their salary, which is already very, very low. It's only about $150 in her case a month. Interestingly, though, I think we shouldn't underestimate how significant it is in itself that she felt, even if anonymously, she was able to express that to me. And I think it's one of the biggest changes that I've certainly noticed since going there a year and a half, 2 years ago, that many people I sensed were starting to feel more emboldened to criticize the government in a way that for some of these people they've never felt able to do in the past.
Well, one of the things I find fascinating about this story is that it's difficult to square some of the things that the Venezuelan government is saying about the United States with other things they're saying about the United States. So on the one hand, they might be calling for the return of President Maduro, and yet on the other hand, when you were there, you reported on the visit of a member of the US government who came to meet Delcy Rodriguez. And I want to ask you about that, but I also want to understand, before we get onto that, what is the actual status of Delcy Rodriguez at the moment? Is she the official president? Has she, taken on all the trappings of that job? What's her role?
Yeah, I mean, she's been sworn in as the interim president, but for all intents and purposes, she is ruling the country now. There has been no, at the moment anyway, no timeline, no process spelled out for any kind of formal elections or democratic process. So she is functioning as the president of the country. But I think you touched on an interesting point there in your question about this sort of mismatch, because I think she's towing this very delicate line at the moment, because on the one hand, she is, yes, there is all these signs internally in the country of continued loyalty to Nicolas Maduro. Her certainly, I think, still trying to satisfy Venezuelans who might be loyal to him, including some of those in her own government, including some of those in the military, for example, while also on the world stage, very much cozying up to the US, to Trump administration officials, talking about how great this relationship between the two countries is, which again is just extraordinary given how this change in relationship started, which was the US bombing Caracas and seizing its leaders.
Well, what actually happened when this member of the US government came? The US Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum. What was that meeting like with Delcy Rodriguez?
Well, it was certainly very cozy. I was there. I went to Miraflores, which is the presidential palace, and it was fascinating because again, when you walk into the presidential palace, it on the surface nothing's changed. There's still Maduro's face everywhere. Slogans about him working for the people, even though he's currently in jail in the US, banners about different achievements he's done in government. And then you see what's actually taking place there, which is this meeting between his former vice president, now interim president Delcy Rodriguez, and a Trump administration official. Just months ago, the US and Venezuela were sort of arch enemies. Now there are these warm handshakes, smiles being exchanged between Doug Burgum and Delcy Rodriguez. He came with this delegation of oil and mining companies, including some from the US. He met with some from Venezuela as well. The whole purpose of his visit was to try and essentially make contacts and shore up investment opportunities, both in Venezuela's oil sector, but also in its mining sector too. So both of them, I think, keen to publicly show that they are on good terms.
I've got this image in my head from what you're describing, Ione. Uh, is Doug Burgum in the presidential palace in Caracas, in the same place as images of Nicolas Maduro and slogans about Nicolas Maduro? Are those two things sitting alongside each other?
Exactly that. And also, maybe more significantly as well, in that meeting with Delcy Rodriguez and Doug Burgum, another figure was there, which was Diosdado Cabello, who is the interior minister in Venezuela. Now, he's the man who was sort of oversaw the armed paramilitaries who operated in Venezuela, who were responsible for cracking down on anti-government dissent. And to see this image of a US minister sat next to him and Delcy Rodriguez is quite extraordinary. It shows just how much, I suppose, the US has been willing to put aside, and Venezuela has been willing to sort of put aside, to allow this economic relationship to develop.
Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, announced back in January one of those things, Ione, that governments all around the world love, a 3-point plan for the future of Venezuela. He talked about three things. He talked about stabilization, recovery, and then transition. But can you explain to us what this all actually means and where we are on the arc of this plan?
Yeah, so to sort of take it step by step, I think stabilization, what he means by that is not immediately having elections, not immediately, I suppose, rupturing the status quo, because, as I say, both I think the US and Venezuela made the calculation that could lead to potentially a lot of instability, maybe even some kind of coup or uprising. So stability, I think, is what they mean by that. Continuity is what they mean by stabilization. Economic recovery is this idea of liberalizing Venezuela's economy, injecting more investment again, trying to revive, for example, the oil industry that's been neglected and underinvested in for many, many years. I think that is a reference to future elections and a democratic process taking place. But that's the bit, I think, which we've heard least about. And that's what's kind of concerning a lot in the opposition in Venezuela. We've not really heard anything about elections. So that side of this is all, I think, very unclear at the moment. And I think a lot of people think that at the moment, it's neither in the US's or Delcy Rodriguez's interest to rock the boat, to change things again. It's not in Delcy Rodriguez's interest because She probably knows that if there was an election now, judging by past opinion polls, that the opposition, if it manages to get united around a single candidate, that the opposition would have quite a good chance of winning. The US knows that if it weren't to have Delcy Rodriguez in power, someone who they can sort of dangle this threat over, that they might not have as compliant a government, or a government that they can kind of threaten into submission. And that's what is most worrying to figures on the opposition, because they do wonder, well, hang on, how long is this democratic transition part going to take?
What's the status of the political opposition right now? Did you meet with them and what did they tell you?
Yeah, I mean, I met with certainly quite a lot of opposition activists and figures. I met with Jesus Armas, who's an opposition activist who kind of worked on essentially running in part, the opposition's campaign at the last election.
I have been a political activist for the last 22 years and actually also a human rights defender. I was the campaign manager of María Corina Machado in el municipio Libertador de Caracas, in the capital of Venezuela. So yeah, and I also have been one of the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition.
And how did your work end up leading to described as a disappearance, a detention? Can you talk us through just what happened?
So the people started to protest on July 29, and I was part of this protest. And also I was part of the team that collected the tallies that helped us to show to the world that Edmundo González Urrutia is the legitimate president of Venezuela. Leadership that could organize a protest or that just were part of the election of the electoral team of María Corina del Mundo was a target for the Maduro's government. So that's why they started to follow me, to pressure me, and finally to jail me.
He said that while of course he's very, he feels a lot's changed since the 3rd of January. He's regained his own freedom. He said it doesn't go far enough because there are still people in jail. And he said for the opposition to have a sort of fair chance at an election, we couldn't, in his words, we couldn't really have an election until everyone's free.
We want the investment of the US. We want the investment of the international companies. We want more free markets in Venezuela. But at the same time, we want democracy. And we want democracy now.
The thing that they want is elections. In terms of what those elections might look like, though, I think there is still a big question mark about them, because who would the opposition candidate be? Because at the moment, we know that the most prominent opposition leader, María Corina Machado, is still, as far as we know, not back in Venezuela. There's the candidate from the last election, Edmundo González, who's still living in exile. And as I say, there are still wanted posters for him all around Venezuela, accusing him of crimes against the state and offering $100,000 in reward for any sighting of him. So I don't think he's got any plans to come back to Venezuela necessarily anytime soon. So I think the opposition is in a bit of a difficult place right now. There's a lot of optimism among them. There's a lot of hope that this is that finally Maduro has gone, which is something they've wanted for a long time, that there's potentially a path now for change in the country. But in terms of them actually seeing a path towards them being elected, I think that is still quite unclear, both in terms of the timescale of elections, but also in terms of who a possible candidate would be. And also, would their candidate be considered sort of palatable to the United States? Because interestingly, when I spoke to people both on the left and the right in Venezuela, both conceded that now whoever the candidates are at the next election, if they are to succeed, will probably need that sort of backing of the United States, given how much the US is essentially calling the shots on a lot of economic decisions at the moment.
I mean, there are, as you mentioned, members of the political opposition who are still in exile, but there are other members of the political opposition who are still sitting in jail in Venezuela, and they've been there since the Maduro days. What's happening with them?
Well, one of the ways in which Delcy Rodriguez has sort of showed to the US, I suppose, that she's willing to comply with their demands is introducing this new amnesty law, which essentially paves the way for a lot of these political prisoners who were jailed under Nicolas Maduro's government to be released. And we have already seen signs of that. There have been hundreds of people who have been released so far, and I spoke to quite a lot of them, including some prominent opposition activists and politicians, but also ordinary people who had basically been caught up in a lot of the crackdown on anti-government sentiment. But there are still hundreds of people who are behind bars, and I think there is still a lot of uncertainty really about whether or not all political prisoners will be released. Venezuela's government has never actually accepted that it's held political prisoners. It's always denied that, but the opposition has long said that these detentions have been a way for the government to crack down on opposing voices and movements.
Well, I mean, it also strikes me as another one of these contradictions in the sense that if the government is releasing some political prisoners, that does appear to be a positive move in a democratic light. It's a move towards potentially more political freedom in Venezuela. But then at the same time, as you've said, there is some evidence the government's also paying people to attend pro-government rallies. How do you square those two things?
You can't really, and that's the thing. I think there are still a lot of there is still a big mismatch between some of what's being said and done publicly and other things. We're still seeing many of the same figures who are associated with that crackdown on dissent still in power, whether that's Diosdado Cabello, the powerful interior minister, or whether it's the new defense minister in the country. Interestingly, Delcy Rodriguez has just got rid of her defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who was also wanted in the US on drug charges, but she's replaced him with a man called Gustavo Gonzalez Lopez, which I don't think will be potentially, much of a reassurance to critics, because he's still a very hardline figure. He was the director of Venezuela's most notorious intelligence service, which was seen often as a sort of quite hostile arm of the state, again, that would crack down on dissent in the country. So there is a bit of a kind of, I can see why many people still feel distrust, still feel nervousness, a nervousness that actually quite a lot hasn't changed still.
I want to understand with you, Ione, what the links, if any, there are between the US government intervention in Venezuela back in January and what we're seeing now with the United States intervention in Iran. One of the things that Doug Burgum said when he was leaving Caracas for that trip that you covered for us, he told reporters on the tarmac as he was leaving that it was a, quote, brilliant strategic move to intervene in Venezuela before the US intervened in Iran. What did you understand by that?
I think he was, sort of saying the quiet bit out loud there, in the sense that he essentially seems to be saying that in his words, doing Venezuela before Iran, the US has opened a new channel of oil to come to the US from Venezuela at a time when global supplies are now being squeezed because of the US action and the subsequent war that has started in Iran. So I think, while I don't think the flow of oil from Venezuela to the United States is necessarily going to be enough to compensate for wider economic chaos, I think there's a deliberate move here, which is that the US does now have that supply from Venezuela, which it has oversight over as well.
Is there a lot of oil going from Venezuela to the United States right now?
The US certainly says so, that there's been millions of barrels of oil that have been headed towards the United States. They've also got this slightly strange and unprecedented new agreement where the US is also allowing Venezuela to now sell oil that was previously sanctioned, as long as the US has oversight of it. So essentially the arrangement that they seem to have come to is that proceeds from that will go into this account, which the US would then have oversight over how that money is spent. And the idea is it will be spent on infrastructure that the country needs, whether that's public services or health services, funding police, other institutions, for example, that might need it, medicines, for example, too.
Well, Doug Burgum is not the only US government official who's linked the intervention in Venezuela with the intervention in Iran. Back at the beginning of March, President Trump was speaking to the New York Times on a phone call, and when he was discussing Iran, and he said, "What we did in Venezuela, I think, is the perfect scenario." You've just been to Venezuela. Is it the perfect scenario?
Well, I'll kind of answer this in two parts because I think, firstly, it's important. Maybe we should unpack what Trump is sort of saying there, which is that I think what he means by perfect scenario is for him, it's a perfect scenario because he has essentially managed to successfully install, to be blunt about it, a puppet government for the US right now in Venezuela. It's a government that now complies with him. I'm not an expert on Iran, but I think it's very clear that despite parallels that Donald Trump tried to make, Iran is not Venezuela. And what we're seeing right now is potentially a situation where maybe critics of Trump would argue that he got quite buoyed by the, quote unquote, success of Venezuela. And yet capitulating Iran's leader was far from that simple. Iran has a mechanism to leverage the most important oil route in this conflict with the US. Venezuela does not. Venezuela had oil that actually was being essentially kind of strangled by the US under its sanctions regime before. So the two situations are very, very different. This is a long-winded way of saying, I guess the answer to your question is success for who? For the United States, I think yes, they would argue this is a perfect model in Venezuela for them. In terms of has this been a great success for people in Venezuela, I think it's much, much too early to say at this point. Where the changes are most tangible are things like the release of political prisoners and the fact that people feel they can speak more freely now without risking repercussion. That is definitely a tangible change. Economically, though, I went to parts of the country which are still living in absolute destitution, chronic water shortages, gas shortages, constant power cuts. So I would say that at this stage, it's very early to say whether actually any of this promise of economic change is going to make a real difference to people's lives in Venezuela. I think after years of corruption, of mismanagement of the economy, of underinvestment, of sanctions, the sign of real change for many people still feels incredibly distant, even with all this talk of new investment.
It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for deciphering it for us, Ione.
Thank you.
That was the BBC's South America correspondent, Ione Wells. And that's it for today's episode. Thanks for watching. The Global Story is also a podcast. We're available every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen. See you next time. Cheerio.